Aloha mai kako. It's an honor to be with you all here this Thursday evening. I am zooming in from Palolo Valley, and my name is Jessica, and I'm the Executive Director of Manoa Heritage Center. Manoa Heritage Center is a 3.5-acre biocultural heritage site in Manoa Valley in the Ahupua of Waikiki on the island of Oahu. And our mission is to promote an understanding of Hawaii's cultural natural heritage. And we do this via programs that are mostly virtual these days with teachers, schools, cultural practitioners, community organizations, and neighbors. And it's so much fun to be here with our friend, Dr. Sam Gon. This is a program called Kahaukani Conversations, and it's an opportunity to share knowledge. And I think Sam I got a preview of his lecture on Sunday, and I think he might tell you a little bit about what that name means, Kahaukani. If not, we can talk about it at the end. Manoa Heritage Center relies on community support, and this program in particular is funded by the Atherton Family Foundation, G.N. Wilcox Trust, Island Insurance, and our good friends at Malama Manoa. So thank you so much. And now I'm going to tell you about Sam. Dr. Sam Ohu Gon was born and raised in Nu'uanu, and throughout over a 40-plus year career in conservation in Hawaii has advocated for the integration of Hawaiian cultural values and knowledge in conservation efforts. He received his BA in zoology from UH Manoa, the first recipient to have Hawaiian accepted as fulfilling the language requirement for a life sciences degree. He went on to the University of California at Davis to earn his master's degree in zoology and his PhD from the Animal Behavior Graduate Group there. And he did a comparative behavioral ecology study of the Hawaiian happy face spider. Sam has worked at the Nature Conservancy of Hawaii for over 30 years and has amassed great personal experience with Hawaiian ecosystems and species on all islands. He was traditionally trained in Hawaiian chant and ceremony by Kumu John Lake and was conferred the kuleana of continuing the teaching of Oli by Kumu John Lake before his passing in 2008. He continues to train chanters in Halau Mele, currently the Halau in residence at the Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum in Honolulu. Combining his knowledge of the ecology of Hawaii with the rich traditional knowledge system here, partially documented in the largest indigenous language archive known in the world, his research involves the multidisciplinary exploration of the changes that have taken place in natural and human landscapes here from pre-human to pre-contact and post-contact times. In doing so, he documented the remarkably small ecological footprint of pre-contact Hawaii, which was also 100% self-sufficient, and contrasts this with the huge loss of native ecosystems today and our current low level of self-sufficiency. He advocates for the integration of Hawaiian knowledge, values, and approaches in modern conservation efforts. For this biocultural approach, he was designated a living treasure of Hawaii in 2014. And Dr. Gon has been a good friend of Manoa Heritage Centers for several decades. And in the early 90s, which we realized is almost several decades ago already, he wrote an interpretive plan for Kuko'oheau, and this is a report that we still refer to today. We're very grateful for his scholarship and expertise. We are recording this session and we'll send out a recording after the webinar. And also, please feel free to use the chat and question and answer, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can afterwards. With that, I'll pass it on to Dr. Gon.
All right, mahalo, Jessica. And aloha again to everybody, all the unseen throngs out there. I'm going to share my screen now. And so if you find that the screen is being partially blocked by me or other images, you can minimize that on your own. I've already minimized myself and tucked myself up in the far corner. So I'm just going to begin. So in his text, Kamo'olelo Hawaii, the 19th century Kanaka intellectual Kepelino wrote this: Ahu kupa na haia Hawaii Imiloa, e noi I wale mai no ka haolea, a ole e pau na hana Hawaii Imiloa. A heap of amazing things can be learned about Hawaii, and however diligently the foreigner inquires, he cannot completely fathom all of the doings of far-seeking Hawaiians. So this presentation on Hawaiian science, Ike o Kapo'e Imiloa, knowledge of a far-seeking people, is inspired by Kepalino's characterization of Hawaiian knowledge as far-seeking, Imiloa. Uh-oh, what's going on? How come it's not advancing? There we go. I just need to hit the advance button hard. So as you, some of you might know, might recognize the phrase at the bottom right that says, Hanau ka uku ko'a ko'a. And that is one of the lines in the Kumulipo, one of the early lines, and it describes the birth of the very first living thing recorded in Hawaii by the Kumulipo, which is the coral polyp. So let's start with the chant for knowledge.
Kulia talania ulia namuia naue tanehiluna kaneheilalo kaakau kaahema kumakani ha ikalani hekilika aka aikalani awila nui make ha ikalani paneitalani eola ke kanaka o meidaloe aka ike kamana ia etahonuala o wahala wali o kahiwai hoi tahua o lelo eli kaume mama wanoa. So this was an oli ho'ona'awau, a chant for enlightenment, and it was full of imagery, if you'll recall, images of biology, of place, of meteorology, of governance and leadership, of religion, of history, all wielded toward the goal of enlightenment. It's intended to put you into a framework where you take many threads and concepts and create a balanced result. It hints at the way Hawaiian learning is not only a matter of intellect, but of practical skill, knowledge, and spiritual growth. Kaloea ka'ike kamana, a parallel to the idea of the holistic being as mature physically, mentally, and spiritually. And there were also ho'ailona, signs of uncertainty, and namu and naue, the mumbling and rustling sounds of searching, nehe luna ilalo ka'akau ka'ahema, looking above and below, turning to the north and to the south, of the flash of insight, kawila nui ma ke hai kalani, the diagonal great flashes of lightning in the heavens, and of the weighty consequences of decisions based on knowledge, pane kalani eola ke kanaka, answer to the chief and the people live. Such is the nature of traditional Hawaiian knowledge. And before we go further, I do want to again acknowledge my training in dual worlds. I was Western trained as a conservation biologist, and as you heard, I earned my bachelor's degree here at UH in zoology before earning my master's and PhD in the study of animal behavior. And I studied the behavior, ecology, and evolution of this wonderful creature, the Hawaiian happy-faced spider, and at the same time, its role in native Hawaiian forest habitats. I've seen firsthand perhaps more native Hawaiian plants and animals in my work as an ecologist with the Nature Conservancy than most Kanaka see in a few lifetimes, and I make it my duty to these native species to know their names and their status on all of the islands. But I owe my Ike Hawaii and my Na'au Hawaii, my traditional knowledge and intuition, to many kumu, but the one that I sat with for a dozen years and from whom I learned Oli, Hawaiian chant, and protocol, and who put me through the Uniki Hu'elepo to emerge as a practitioner of Oli and protocol, a kahuna ka kalaleo. That one is Kumujan, Keola Maka Ainana, Kalahui, o Kalani no Kamehameha e Kolu Lake, shown here leading us in chants for Queen Lili'u o Kalani's birthday at Iolani Palace a number of years ago. But this time I have with you tonight is to discuss Hawaiian science. What is it? What distinguishes it? Why should you understand it? Let's start with some recent views of the relationship between science and Hawaiian culture. There have been some ostensibly polar interactions between science and Hawaiian communities. It tends to give the impression that Hawaiian culture has very little to do with science, but we should examine this more closely. And here is the premise of the day, that science is a process not restricted to Western civilization, and Ike Hawaii, traditional Hawaiian knowledge, can provide value to our modern endeavors. If we're to explore the integration of science and culture in today's context, we need to start with definitions. And once defined, it's a fairly straightforward process to assess whether something qualifies against the definition. So what is science?
Science is an approach to learning, and it's marked by empiricism, that is observation, manipulations by experimentation, prediction in the modern sense by modeling, testing of those models and the replication of tests, that so-called proof of hypotheses, and then finally the transmission of this information. And in today's context, that's usually by publication. So, when we start with empirical observation, many elements of a traditional Hawaiian approach are quite consistent with what we would call the scientific approach. Hawaiian traditional knowledge was empirical, based on repeated observations of phenomena in the world, land, sea, and sky, bent on detecting and expressing correlations and testing predictions and consequences. Many olelo no eao take on the form of correlative statements, as in the following examples. Pua ka wiliwili na nahu kamano. The wili-wili blooms, the shark bites. The matching of seasonal phenomena of land and sea is a hallmark of Hawaiian knowledge systems. The blooming season for wili-wili is actually right now at the end of the kauwela, the hot season, and before the rains of the ho'oilo, or the wet season, arrive. This matches peak aggregations of sharks in shallow waters called lala ni kalalea, rows of protruding fins, that occur at the same time. The practical consequence of predicting shark behavior through a land phenomena, the blooming of a particular plant, is obvious. Long before you enter the water, you know to be extra watchful for sharks. Or how about this observed correlation? Pua ke ko kumai ka he'e. The sugarcane are blooming, the octopus appear. In Hawaii, ko blooms at the start of the ho'oilo around November, and this correlates with the peak abundance period of mature he'e on the reefs. Recall that he'e come into maturity within a year and live no longer than about a year and a half. So this suggests that any seasonality in mating creates cohorts of young that are planktonic and of extremely small size during at least half of the year. When they reach an edible size, they would rather suddenly make their appearance to the observant reef fishers who made the initial correlative observation. Or this equally famous correlation, pala kahala momona kavana. The pala fruit are ripe, the sea urchins are fat with eggs. And if you enjoy the ha'uke as much as I do, you start to ono for them when the ripe, fragrant fruit of hala are falling from the trees. So this kind of seasonal correlation statement is a production of centuries of generational corroboration of older observations. But for how many more generations will these olelo no eao continue to hold true if global climate changes occur on land and sea that shift one or both of the cycles of the creatures involved? The perspective of the Hawaii Imiloa, of the far-seeking Hawaiian, is that broken correlations will fade and new correlations will be observed, suggested, and tested as they always have been. In fact, the classical olelo no eao will remind us as historical observations of times when the world was different. Going back to the wili-wili and the sharks, the utility of this olelo no eao goes far beyond the empirical observation of natural correlation. The meaning of this saying depends on the context in which it is said. When something beautiful and desirable appears, even in modern society, someone might say, the sharks are circling already. Whether it is that parking space you're vacating, that last piece of maui manju on the plate being eyed by you and your friends, or in the ancient times, that beautiful woman surrounded by suitors. Secondary contextual meanings are a major part of Hawaiian communication. The hidden meaning in Hawaiian statements is called kauna and lies at the heart of Hawaiian wisdom and interpretation of olelo no eao. Natural phenomena in ancient Hawaii were often characterized as kino lau, the physical manifestations of akua, or deities. For example, Lono was seen as the akua of the winter rains and presided over the seasonal cultivation of uala, sweet potato, and ipu, gourd, in the drier arable lands. The season of Lono is ho'oilo, the winter Hawaiian wet season, and is marked by the makahiki, the start of the traditional Hawaiian year. Only during this time of year was cultivation of rain-dependent crops of the leeward drylands possible, and sometimes the window for cultivation was very narrow. Like Kuka'o'o, many of the heiau servicing agriculture in such zones were dedicated to Lono, and with heiau ho'olu'ua, Temples where prayers were directed to bring rain. Some of the chants to Lono directly indicate the connection between that major Hawaiian god and the meteorology of winter through the evocation of clouds. With such chants, the kahuna could evoke rain as needed, for example, in famine times. O tino e lono I kalani, he au lo, he au poko, he au ti e, he au halo, he au ho'opua I talani. So important are these cloud signs in the heaven that when you consult traditional Hawaiian sources, there are hundreds of names of cloud forms, clouds that prognosticate the coming weather and were studied intently and named. Here are a few examples. Yaupua'a, the Auloa, the long clouds, Au Manu, the bird clouds, Au Ilio Ula, the red dog clouds, Au Onio, the spotted clouds, Au Pu'ulima, the fish-shaped clouds. All at their simplest level, visual features in the heavens formed of condensed water. But when combined with traditional knowledge systems, important ho'ailona indications of times to plant, times to avoid oceanic voyaging, times to prepare offerings to the fishing gods, times to set medicinal herbs to dry, times to store water. Sometimes attention to these ho'ailona made the difference between life and death. But for all the attention paid to the more prominent kinolau of the Akua in their realm, it must be pointed out that in the Hawaiian perspective, all of the thousands of living denizens of the Wawa Akua, the upland realm of the gods, are considered manifestations of the gods, and as such can hold huge significance that belies their physical stature. Take the tiny fern Shizea robusta that bears the name Oali'i Makali'i. It's easy to completely disregard, growing inconspicuously among the mosses and seedlings of the forest floor high in the mountains. But there is a chant to Lono that in the very first line links this fern to the deity of the winter wet season, the Ho'oilo. The chant goes, Elono ita oali'i, elono limo, elono lilani, elono italana mainu, elono ikamakaiva, and on with different Lono forms. But the very first one was Lono ita oali'i, Lono in the oali'i fern. So the chant establishes the connection of the fern to Lono, but if you're familiar with the traditions of Lono, you know that he's the god presiding over the makahiki season, the celebration of the fertility of the land and the promise of the bounty of the new year. And perhaps many of you, I would expect, would know the astronomical ho'ailona of the advent of the makahiki season, which is the constellation called the Seven Sisters or the Pleiades. When that rises at sunset, the makahiki begins. And the Hawaiian name for the Pleiades is Makali'i. So Oali'i Makali'i then is the kino of Lonoika Makahiki. No coincidence that this fern matures and becomes thick and full with golden brown spores during the makahiki season. And when we did our preview, we noted that if you look at the two rightmost fronds of this fern and the way the clusters are held, and you look at the constellation of the Makali'i in the sky in that picture, the resemblance is perhaps not coincidental. So the kinolau complex assignments were complex based upon the context of the symbolic natural phenomena. There were countless variations of natural phenomena. And not surprisingly, there were the Kiniakua, the 40,000 gods, each with names, personalities, and duties. In contrast to Lono, Ku is the god of the hot summer season and of war and chiefly governance. But that simplified dichotomy does not suffice to characterize the many kinolau of Ku. If Ku is the god of war, it might make sense that a koa tree, itself sharing the name of a warrior, might be among the kinolau of Ku. But the red color that is symbolic of Ku can be found in the red lehua blossoms, the red of iiwi feathers, and also the red of certain fish of the sea, such as the aveoveo. Ku ula, red Ku, is the main god of fishing, and the connection of fishing to the sky is seabirds. So another kino of Ku is the Hawaiian fairy tern, called the manuo Ku, the bird of Ku. Unlike migratory seabirds such as moali or albatross or the kolea or plover, which appear only in the winter and were kino of Lono, the manuo Ku are residents year-long, and their flocks wheeling above schools of fish were the guidance of Ku ula to the lawai, the fishermen. Thus, the behavior of elements of the universe were described in terms of the behaviors of the Kino Lao, themselves expressions of the uncountable gods. The Kino Lao system is far more complex than this chart depicts, but the point of it is that between all of the Kiniakua, every season, every human activity, every food, and everything in the natural world would be represented. In this manner, all observations and connections of the world around you could be organized in terms of their presiding akua. Note in particular how Ku and Lono hold sway over time cycles, dividing the year into the wet and dry season. And Kane and Kanaloa do the same for space, with Kane presiding over the land and fresh water, and Kanaloa over the surrounding sea. Together, the four major Hawaiian gods preside over space and time. So their realms of influence in space and time taken together cover all phenomena of land, sea, and sky, as well as human behavior, and part of their realms are entirely under their jurisdiction. Kanaloa, for example, as god of the sea, is also the god of oceanic voyaging. Kane, as god of freshwater, oversees water-intensive agriculture. And because Ku is god of both governance and the hot summer months, warfare between chiefs was only allowed during the summer. And during Lono's wet, cool season, warfare was forbidden, and the fine arts were the focus. Moving on then to experimentation. Hawaiians manipulated natural systems toward particular goals, and this is well seen in both lokoi'a, fish pond engineering, and design of lo'i, the agricultural terraces, and awai, the irrigation channels that fed them. Biological manipulations, such as hand pollination of plants, with the express purpose of increasing seeds, that has also been documented. In fact, it was Mayen, a French botanist visiting the islands in the 1800s, that wrote in his journal about encountering a Hawaiian woman bent over a Hawaiian poppy, manipulating its flowers. So he asked her what she was doing. And she explained that by taking the ehu, the dust, the pollen, from one flower to another, she would increase the number of edible seeds produced. Mayen was astounded at this glimpse of the intimate empirical science of Hawaiians in their living landscape. Estimates of the Hawaiian pre-contact population range from 300,000 to 800,000, and at the higher end, this rivals today's population densities and was entirely self-sufficient. Today, without our steady influx of imported goods, we'd perhaps be eyeing each other hungrily in about 3 weeks. So the idea of manipulations that yield change in conditions, that's a very Hawaiian thing. Recently, some colleagues and I published a paper on using GIS models to indicate the footprint of both wet lo'i and dryland fields in pre-contact Hawaii. The paper examined the requirements of the two major staple crops of Hawaii, kalo, taro, and uala, sweet potato, and filtered for the combinations of topographic, climatic, and soil conditions that provided for the highest potential of those two crops. For kalo, the optimum combination is plentiful water, low elevation warm settings, and gentle slopes, valley bottoms in other words. For uala, the critical condition is winter rainfall sufficient to support growth of the vines and tubers, but not so heavy as to leach the nutrients from the soil. Older soils typically had insufficient nutrients to start with, so younger substrate age was another factor. When we tested the model against actual archaeological complexes that related to the two groups, we saw remarkable convergence, indicating that Hawaiians had developed many, if not all, areas of highest agricultural potential for kalo and uala. So you notice that in each of these examples, the blue solid and the red solid were for where the model said kalo should grow best and uala, respectively. And the light teal lines are the archaeology related to the farming of those two crops. And the match was just astounding. So the Hawaiian model was expressed, not in a computer file, but across tens of thousands of acres of land and applied science at a landscape scale. Although in ancient Hawaii, there may not have been any formal publication of results to encourage replication, there was certainly oral transmission of knowledge and testing through practice. Any knowledge that could not be practically replicated or gave inconsistent results would likely not be further promulgated. So these olelo no'ea point to the need to verify that which is heard via direct experience. He lohe pepeau, a he ike maka ho'i. Was it a piece of hearsay that you heard by ear, or did you actually see it with your own eyes? O ka mea kupono pa'a, that which is righteous, hold on to it. O ka mea hewa kapaia'e, that which is flawed, set aside. Notice that it didn't say reject or throw out. That which is flawed for the moment, that doesn't fit the conditions of or the context that you're interested in, perhaps the context needs to change in order for that information to be valid. So you don't reject it, you set it aside against the time when the conditions are just right, and suddenly what was told to you becomes entirely relevant. So it's very interesting that Hawaiian knowledge is not so binary as Western science. Is it true or false? I'm often asked, I've heard this and I've heard that, which is right and which is wrong? And in Hawaiian knowledge systems, you wouldn't say that this one is right and that one is wrong. You would say, I've heard this from this source on this island, and I've heard that from another source from that island. And you would have to see whether or not the conditions on the two islands are different and whether or not the information is valid in their particular places and not necessarily valid universally. But the main point is we pass on what is demonstrably true. So if we accept that Hawaiians are scientists, what distinguishes Hawaiian science from Western science? We started talking about one of those dichotomies, but there are some implied assumptions about Hawaiian versus Western approaches, especially with regard to worldview. These are oversimplified here, but they serve to highlight the contrast. These were put together when considering the revegetation of Kaho'olawe. So, in the Western viewpoint, land is a commodity which one manipulates toward best use. Biological elements are often manipulated dramatically from wild toward human-friendly domesticated forms. People are viewed as hired labor to realize a scope of work. Plants and animals are objects to be reintroduced to the island. How many willy willy seedlings are there going to be in this particular helicopter drop? Biological elements are separate from cultural man-made elements on the landscape. Whereas in the Hawaiian worldview, the land is a conscious entity reacting to humans in a reciprocal relationship. Ecosystems may be modified, but often remain semi-wild with key ecological processes intact. People are connected spiritually with place, become part of place, and contribute to and benefit from place. Plants and animals are considered conscious individuals themselves, requiring individual attention to thrive. And plants and animals are sacred kino lau of Kiniakua and part of the living cultural landscape. So here's an example. In conventional thought, the Hawaiian owl is a low to middle priority element in restoration of Kaho'olawe, since it's not endemic to Kaho'olawe and not crucial to its revegetation. But in Hawaiian view, the pueo is a spiritual connection to an island otherwise made entirely unfamiliar by major land use changes and alien species invasions. So the pueo becomes an auspicious and positive sign. A Hawaiian botanist or Hawaiian archaeologist would be just as excited to see a pueo on island as the zoologist would be. This is because the pueo is not only a biological feature, but a deeply cultural symbol, a biocultural highlight, an ancestral presence, and aumakua to many families. So I'm going to tell a brief story here. And it deals with when I was on the island of Kaho'olawe for nearly a week with a team of folks working on the priority setting for the island. And the island was not yet cleared of ordnance, and so it's very dangerous to be there, especially at night. And so we were told never to leave the safety of the camp, go as far as the outhouse that was set aside from the camp. But one morning I woke up really early, pre-dawn. I went to use the bathroom, and after that, I noticed that it was getting toward dawn. And I also thought to myself, well, you know, the road that led up to the helipad above our campsite must be safe, and the helipad itself must be safe. And so I sneaked up while everybody else was sleeping, up onto the helipad to view the growing light in the eastern sky. And at the time, Kumu Lake was teaching us chants to the aumakua that his grand uncle offered before dawn. And so I thought, this would be a great time to offer that to that chant. So I started on that chant. It's a low, quiet chant offered to the darkness. And as I started chanting, I noticed dark shapes passing in front of my eyes. And it became clear that there were a number of dark shapes circling me. And in the growing light, I became aware that they were owls. There were, as far as I could tell, 4 pueo that were circling me as I chanted. And as soon as I realized that, it was everything that I could do to continue the chant to completion, because the kapu of the chanter is once the chant begins, it must be given correctly all the way to its end, and then the kapu of the chant is lifted. So I was able to finish that chant as the owls flew in circles around me as dark shapes against the barely lit sky. And when I finished, the dawn was brightening, but still far from rising. And so I was able to more clearly see the owls circling, and they circled farther and farther. Their circles got larger and larger until they finally disappeared into the distance. And I went silently back to the campsite. I told no one about this all through the rest of the trip. But when I returned and I told Kumalek about it, he just smiled knowingly, because of course the pueo is Kumalek's aumakua, and of course they would respond to a chant of his ancestors that were given to his aumakua. So I'll move on now. So the tendency of Western approaches to separate natural resources and cultural resources is seen in the common practice of creating separate natural resource management plans versus cultural resource management plans. The Hawaiian approach of natural resources as cultural resources is reflected in the current trend to characterize biocultural resources and integrate resource management. So the image that you see here is a shrine on Kaho'olawe, and the offering on that shrine is a he'e. And of course, the he'e is one of the kinolau of Kanaloa, and the island of Kaho'olawe itself is considered a kinolau of Kanaloa. So if you didn't know that, you didn't know that biocultural connection, then this would just be an image of an artful image of an octopus that's laid out on a pile of rocks. So indeed, at the end of 2018, a special issue of the journal Sustainability was devoted to biocultural restoration in Hawaii, and I was honored to be an author of one of the articles. The issue represents the largest body of peer-reviewed articles involving not only Native Hawaiian authors, but the highest percentage of female authors in a scientific compilation, trends that are refreshing and bode well for the future. Hawaii will be a leader in biocultural approaches, and I encourage all of you to read this open access special issue. To find it, it's easy. Just Google Sustainability Special Issue Biocultural Restoration in Hawaii. Western science has a reputation of being coldly objective, while Hawaiian knowledge is not divorced from emotion. It's said to be guided maikana'o, from the gut. In truth, intuition and passion are critical to scientific inquiry in both Hawaiian and non-Hawaiian contexts. But the Hawaiian approach embraces intuition and feelings readily, while Western science might view intuition as the least objective part of a process of inquiry and mistrust decisions that are made on intuitive hunches alone. This is a key point in the perceived conflict between science and culture, but any respected and experienced cultural practitioner would accede that not all hunches are reliable, and that the best intuitive guidance is based on long experience and a subconscious matching of options with what is known to be true. That is, what feels pono in the na'au is what best fits with a lifetime of learning. It should also be pointed out that the objective approach can be a limitation of Western science when it allows for amoral or immoral scientific developments. Some of these have been of extreme disservice to humankind, and such a history accounts for much of the general public's current distrust of science. We sometimes see clear examples of Western science converging upon long-standing tenets of traditional Hawaiian knowledge. Hawaiians speak of the na'au, the guts, as the source of ideas and wisdom. And Western science long demeaned the quaint idea of the intestinal tract being the brain of Hawaiians. However, recently, the findings of Dr. Michael Gershon, the author of The Second Brain, demonstrate how the enteric nervous system, the nervous system associated with our digestive system, relatively independent of brain spinal cord control, in fact provides powerful feedback on our behavior, creating a sense of unease when a decision is potentially wrong or dangerous. Gershon speaks of the enteric nervous system as a holdover from our ancient evolutionary past, while Hawaiians would speak of listening within to the guidance of ancestors, mai kapo mai, from the distant past. To balance the idea of Western and Hawaiian approaches as distinct, there are also many commonalities. Relevant to the restoration approaches in this case, these commonalities run broad and apply to other modern situations. Both Western and Hawaiian approaches recognize ecological zones, engage in manipulative experimentation, take an active stance on pest control, engage in species transplantation, recognize and value the need for expert consultation, as well as the need to impose and lift resource-related restrictions, and both express concern for the future of resources. Practical application of Hawaiian knowledge takes us beyond shared practices and into modern management action. Ike guides restoration efforts to coordinate efforts with proper attention to weather and seasonal climate, to approach plantings as the management of semi-wild ecosystems, to take advantage of well-developed Hawaiian agricultural protocols for propagation via seeds, cuttings, etc., hand pollination, selection of dryland cultivars, and to utilize specialized Hawaiian techniques for drylands, which have been described, including kuaivi rock mulching, as well as conventional mulching, fertilizing, and irrigation where possible to maximize soil and moisture retention via terracing. So Hawaiian knowledge extends to human interactions, coordination, and cooperation as well. Ho'oponopono, of course, is the Hawaiian science of dispute resolution. Central to Hawaiian life is the idea of blending of material and spiritual, and success in life is defined by physical, moral, and spiritual growth. So on the island of Kaho'olawe, there were often strict protocols set in place, and moral conduct of the restoration teams was important during the work and considered vital for success. Traditional knowledge supports modern scientific endeavors. Before 1989, the nesting colonies of the endangered Hawaiian petrel, the ua'u, on Kauai, were unknown to Western science. But according to the mo'olelo of the island of Kauai, Lauhaka was the nephew of Kanealoha and was trained to be a kiamanu, a bird catcher. He seasonally lived on the cliffs of Wainiha near Mauna Hina to wait for the ua'u to come back into nest. This place is called Haleo Lauhaka, the House of Lauhaka, and is even labeled as such on USGS topographic map. So in the summer of 1989, summer being the nesting and breeding season for ua'u, we selected to camp at Haleo Lauhaka, essentially reoccupying the House of Lauhaka. And there we heard the night calls of the ua'u returning to their nests in the uluhe-covered cliffs, confirming the oral tradition and demonstrating the value of mo'olelo to biologists. Another example comes out of the geological mapping of West Molokai. Aya ke anakoi I Kaluakoi. There is an adze quarry at Kaluakoi. Kaluakoi is on the west end of Molokai. The ko'i, or stone adze, made only of the densest, fine-grained basalts, is the most important tool of ancient Hawaii, which has been described as an advanced Neolithic culture. The ko'i could be used to carve canoes, build houses, shape the impressive tiki images of major heiau. Kaluakoi is a place on the west end of Molokai, as I said, and its name harkens to the vitally important ko'i resource to be found there. Lua is a pit, so Kaluakoi means the adze pit. When the geological map of Molokai was first drafted by famous geologist Harold Stearns in the early 20th century, it was funded by the sugar planters, whose primary motivation, of course, was water resources. So the water-rich East Molokai was extremely well mapped, while West Molokai was treated as a single, simple, undifferentiated unit. John Sinton, then geology professor here at UH Manoa, took on the task of mapping West Molokai, more properly. And what he found impressed him greatly. Everywhere he went, he found Hawaiians had established quarries and capping lavas. Moreover, the highest quality adze quarries were to be found in a specific subset of the capping lava shown in darker blue. And every single example of this subtype he found was a particularly well-used adze quarry site. All this led Dr. Sinton to remark that Hawaiians were superb regional geologists, recognizing the shared characteristic of distinct exposures and applying this in their search for sources of their primary tool. Hawaiian science resulted in some remarkable emergent patterns, especially in the realm of applied ecosystem services. When laid over major ecological systems, the Ahupua'a boundaries of Oahu, largely unchanged since formalized by Ma'ilikukahi around 1400, show remarkable distribution of resource areas from summit to ocean. Note in particular the convergence of Ahupua'a of the central leeward Ko'olau toward the hugely productive estuarine systems of Pu'uloa, now largely destroyed by industrialization and pollution. It's not well known that Oahu and not Molokai had the largest number of fish ponds, most lining the Avalau of Pu'uloa, the many locks of Pu'uloa. Ike Hawaii often requires a broad geographic knowledge for full understanding. This is because the Hawaiian concept of Aina is made up of layers within layers. This allows a Kanaka from anywhere in the Hawaii to consider Aina simultaneously as his pahale, his Ahupua'a, his moku or district, his mokupuni or island, his pai aina or archipelago, and ultimately all the way to the honua, the whole world, affecting what is happening right around him or her. So here's an example of the extent of place connections that makes sense when concentric context is understood. So Pu'umo'iwi, shown by the star here, is an adze quarry on Kaho'olave. Kaho'olave is an ahupua'a of the Honua Ula moku of the island of Maui. Honua Ula is one of 12 moku of Maui Island, and Maui is part of the Pai'aina, the archipelago of Hawaii. Kaho'olave is also the kinolo of Kanaloa, one of the 4 principal akua of Hawaii and a god of oceanic voyaging. Kaho'olave was a training site preparing navigators for voyaging between Hawaii and the rest of Polynesia. And so recently, an adze from Pu'umo'iwi was found in the Tuamotu archipelago in French Polynesia. So, you know, it confirms the links between Hawaii and Central Polynesia during the open voyaging phase of Hawaiian prehistory. Finding that adze in the Tuamotus would be otherwise bewildering, except for the contextual knowledge rings that I just described here. In 2010, the Hawaii Conservation Alliance, comprised of over 25 agencies and organizations, ratified a position paper entitled Hawaiian Culture and Conservation in Hawaii, with a preamble that reads thus: in Hawaii, integration of Native Hawaiian approaches and knowledge systems with conventional conservation efforts is essential to achieve a vision of sustainable communities of people actively perpetuating thriving lands and seas through management and restoration. The challenge for the future is how to train professionals in dual worlds so they can wield the best of both systems. What would it take to wield Hawaiian science toward this vision? It would take language skills. Hawaiian knowledge is transmitted using the subtleties of Hawaiian language. It would need firm grounding in Hawaiian natural history, of course, and firm grasp of traditional Hawaiian pre-contact and historical accounts. Because Ike Hawaii was transmitted orally, much was lost in the epidemics of the 1800s, and only the portions of Ike that were shared by surviving families and by scholars, including non-Hawaiians, who took the time to render into writing that which was previously orally transmitted, survived into modern times. But now there are advantages that can help shortcut the rebuilding process. Technologies allow us to record and share bodies of traditional information via transcription of the large Hawaiian knowledge archives in the newspaper into electronic searchable form. Practitioners now can travel across the archipelago, visiting and gathering firsthand observations that arguably would be beyond the reach of a lifetime of travel in ancient times. The effort to integrate Ike Hawaii into scientific endeavors in Hawaii is young, But the hope is that young practitioners with dual training in Hawaiian and Western knowledge systems will emerge to make the rapprochement a commonplace mainstream practice in the generations to come, to the benefit of us all. And we are counting on you. And with that, I'll end with mahalo and any questions or reactions that you might have.
Mahalo, Sam. I can hear all of our attendees clapping with applause. That was amazing. So amazing.
Mahalo.
Aloha McGuffey says, wow, with all capitalized. I see one question that has come in. Sorry, I'm just digesting. Can you tell us about your virtual backdrop?
Well, this is a mirrored image of the head of Waikolu Valley, looking toward the north, from the boundary of Kamako Preserve on the island of Molokai. It was taken by Ricky Cook, who is, let's see, I think he's the nephew of Sam Cook, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, Sam Cook was one of the founding board members and the earliest chair of the Nature Conservancy of Hawaii. And so to honor him, and by means of honoring him through this image, honoring the Manoa Heritage Center.
Thank you. Matthew McConnell is asking, where and how can we get the slides/recording? And so the recording will be emailed after the webinar. It takes a few minutes to process, and then it'll go out to everybody who's on the call. And maybe we can talk separately about the slides, Sam. I do have your slides, but I don't know if you want me to share them.
Yeah, I think that many of those images were given to me with permission to use as these kind of ephemeral presentations. So we wouldn't want, for example, Ricky Cook makes his living as a photographer, right? And so we wouldn't want to be just giving away his amazingly awesome images, such as this one. If anybody who knows Waikolu will note that this is backwards, right? It's mirrored. And that was only because whenever I raise my right hand, I need to see my right hand raise on the, it throws me off to see me raise my right hand and then have it come up on the left side. So I mirrored my images for these kinds of presentations.
Jenny Leong is asking, are there resources for sharing this knowledge with K through 12 students in Hawaii that you've come across?
Well, you know, the whole thing with Hawaiian knowledge systems now is that it is a matter of pulling from a large number of sources. Lucky for us, I mean, some of those major sources have been compiled out of the Hawaiian language newspapers, and they show up as, say, the works of David Malo, which is called Hawaiian Antiquities. But actually, I will tell you something. If you read Hawaiian Antiquities in English, and then you go to David Malo's Mo'olelo Hawaii, which is essentially the Hawaiian language version of the thing, and you read them side by side, the translation is not the same as what he wrote. And so there are times when I've scratched my head at the English interpretation and then looked at his words in Hawaiian and realized, oh, he wasn't saying that at all. He was saying something else. And so it is dual fluency is a really useful thing in these kinds of researches. And the Hawaiian language newspapers, of course, only maybe we're lucky if 10% have been even digitized yet, and a much smaller percentage of that has been translated. And so, if you want to do like a search for a rare Hawaiian plant or animal, and you can go in through the digitized searchable sources and put in your search term, you'll get a whole bunch of, or you might get a whole bunch of hits. But unless you know to read the context of what is being said there, sometimes it'll be completely wrong. Like if you look for monk seal and you find that name, you find that word and you pull it up and you say, oh, look, here's a mention of the monk seal. And it turns out that it was a translation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Hawaiians were translating all kinds of classic works. And so they would use the name of the monk seal, which is the only seal that Hawaiians knew, to describe the seal that was being harpooned by, by somebody in that story. So
many levels.
So, yeah, there are many levels, and so Kamakau, Malo, Kepelino, and many other sources that are available now. More and more of them have been reprinted, and so I would encourage you to find those standard sources of Hawaiian knowledge. I think many of them are probably on the shelves at Manoa Heritage Center.
It's true. Nanette Napoleon is asking, can you talk about Puakea Nogelmeyer's newspaper translation project as it relates to ecology and land management?
Well, I know that that is an ongoing process. It's a difficult thing because it's an expensive and slow process. But he has already been asked for things like the names, in what context are the names of the winds and rains, and he's also been asked about, for example, what was the evidence that pigs were in the forest before Cook's time, or what was their role in Hawaiian society? Because we all know now that pigs that are running loose in the forest is not a good thing for the forest. And if you think about it, pigs running free at all in ancient Hawaii would have been big trouble. They would be in your neighbor's koala patch digging stuff up, and you would be the one to blame if they turned out to be your pigs. And so pigs were heavily managed creatures in Hawaii and highly valuable sources of protein. You wouldn't want them running around. The idea of letting them loose in the forest and then hunting them afterwards is a very modern, you would almost say a colonial viewpoint on what to do.
Interesting. Let's see. Linda Green is asking for the reference in sustainability that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, I will repeat it in the chat right here.
Perfect.
So essentially, I just said you can Google sustainability is the name of the journal. And then the special issue, so you would put special issue, was on biocultural. So biocultural restoration in Hawaii. So if you just put in that phrase, or you might be lucky and even get, with sustainability special issue biocultural, you probably would get the same result. But that's the easiest way I found, because otherwise you would have to, find the ISBN or the locator for a particular scientific journal to hunt for it easily. But this one gets it, and I tested it myself to make sure. When people say, how do I find it? I just tell them, Google sustainability special issue biocultural restoration in Hawaii, and you will find it. That was just a couple of years ago. So 2018, late 2018. 2019 was when a special issue was when an article that I wrote with Kavika Winter, who some of you might be familiar with. He's doing a lot of good work on ahupua'a restoration. At first he was doing that at Limahuli on Kauai when he was the director of the Limahuli Gardens there. And then now he's the research head for the National Estuarine Research Reserve at He'eia. So he's involved in the whole He'eia ahupua'a restoration. Wow. The kalo restoration there, the clearing of mangroves, and the fish pond down at the bottom is all mountain to sea type of things. And so he and I wrote an article for American Scientists. That was in 2019, fall, I think, July, August. And it was called A Hawaiian Renaissance That Could Save the World. And, that sounds pretty bold. And in fact, it was while we were working on the drafts of it that they asked us for a working title. And so we thought, we'll just give them that. And we fully expected it to be changed when it finally came out, but it resonated with them. And when they read the article, they decided that it was an appropriate title. And so it was entitled A Hawaiian Renaissance That Could Save the World. And he essentially talked about some of the things that I talked about here. Ancient Hawaii was extremely sustainable. that there was intimate knowledge of the workings of land and sea that contributed to a co-prosperity of people and their environment. Because how can the people thrive if the Aina isn't thriving as well? When you think about it, the sorry state, the majority of the sorry state that we're in comes when you try to commodify the land, entirely replace what's on it with something else, and lose the ecosystem services and the diversity that it once held. So, so that article came out, and it actually credited the Hawaiian Renaissance with the resurrection of valuing of Hawaiian knowledge.
Wow.
And the application of that knowledge to today's world. And so I remember one point in the thing I said, the Hawaiian Renaissance of the 1970s, and Kavika said, what are you talking about? The Hawaiian Renaissance is still happening. And he's exactly right. It started in the 60s and 70s, but it is an ongoing thing. I was talking with Nainoa Thompson when we were on the worldwide voyage, and he said, you know, Sam, it took 40 years to go from the first sail down to Tahiti to the point where we had enough people trained that we could navigate, get enough crews to navigate all the way around the world. And we were talking about it, and it's like, the next step in the Hawaiian Renaissance is to recapture the knowledge that made Hawaiians such superb naturalists, and landscape ecologists, and ecosystem managers. You know, if we could do that, then we would, it's the same kind of intimate attention to the details of the ocean applied to the land.
It's inspiring. So speaking of the ocean, Lori Foreman is asking, the examples of linking what happens on land to events in the sea were fascinating. Does that extend to the stars too? Are there some land, sea, sky examples?
I'm sure we can find some. For example, remember the example of the Oali'i Makali'i, the little fern that comes into sporulation at the same time that the Pleiades arrive in the sky, marking the start of Lono's season of peace and fertility. So, so there was one without even thinking about it. I'm sure there are others.
The questions are popping in now. Is there a published reference about Kinolau available? Somebody wanted to
yeah, there are sections in both Kamakau and in Malo about Aumakua and Kinolau. So in fact, Kamakau is not a single publication, right? He wrote the series called Po'ekahiko, The People of Old. And so one of them is the people of old, the works of the people of old, the stories of the people of old, you know, and each of those has different elements in it. That is one source. Another surprising one was written by social workers. And they consulted with Mary Kavena Pukui to create the 2-volume book called Nana Ike Kumu. And Nana Ike Kumu essentially was meant as a guide for social workers dealing with Hawaiian clients.
Wow.
And she, the social workers were sometimes just stymied by things that they did or said that were offensive to their clients, or behavior of their clients that they just could not fathom. Why are they behaving this way? And so they consulted with Marika Venapukui, and she created this amazing set of tenets in Hawaiian social behavior that got turned into a 2-volume set. Now, volume 1 is the one that I find most useful because it is a foundational one. It talks about things like Aumakua and Kinolau and Ho'ailona and Po and Ao and all kinds of elements of the Hawaiian worldview or epistemology.
And it's Kau'i Merit says that volume 3 is coming out soon.
Oh my gosh. But really, that's amazing to me. I know that the work continues, right? I mean, Kamana'o Crab got his degree working on Ho'oponopono. And of course, there have been many Ho'oponopono practitioners that take that ancient Hawaiian social healing procedure into modern times.
Awesome. Ta'ivi is asking, does the happy face spider have a Hawaiian name, and does it make a web?
Okay, so the happy face spider has been conferred a Hawaiian name that I find entirely unsatisfactory. And it's because all it says is like nana nana is spider, generic, and then makaki'i is like masked, or yeah, and so
Too simple.
it essentially means clown face spider or something like that. I don't like it. What I note is that the colors of the Hawaiian happy face spider are the royal colors, right? They're the colors that you would find on an ahu'ula.
That's true.
And so I bet you any Hawaiian looking at it would like be struck by the idea that here, this tiny little form is something wearing the colors of the ali'i. And
wow.
I would have been, if I were naming it, if I had run across it, 500 years ago, who knows what name would have come up, but it sure wouldn't have been, clown face spider. Yeah. Hawaiian names were much more sophisticated than that.
Right.
Yeah.
That's too literal.
So one of these days, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to find a respected practitioner, show them a whole bunch of pictures of Hawaiian happy face spiders, maybe even take them up into the mountains like I took Eddie Kamai to see his first Hawaiian happy face spider, and then he wrote that song, children's song about the spider. I want to take them and get them intimately familiar with the spider, and then tell them, sleep on it and give me an inoa po, right? Give me an inoa that comes to you in your sleep. And that would satisfy me more.
Does it make a web?
It does build a web. It doesn't make a web like a standard spider web, but it does use web. And it lives on the underside of a leaf. And that's a wonderful place for a spider to be in a wet forest, because whenever it rains, you've got your umbrella already built in.
Right.
And the color yellow, when you turn a leaf up and you look through it at the light, that light that comes through is this bright chartreuse green, right? Huh. And yellow will turn invisible against that. And then the red spots and various dark markings would match the dark markings that are under any typical leaf.
So it's camouflaged.
And so it would be camouflaged. The only time that you see a Hawaiian happy face spider is red, yellow, and black is when you turn the leaf over, but no bird can turn the leaf over, not easily anyway. So it builds this network of webs underneath the leaf in order to hold on tight underneath the leaf. And then it uses the leaf itself rather than the web as a vibration. Like it would be like living under a drum. And if you ever heard birds walking on your roof, you can tell where the bird is. And so the spider would be able to tell where the insect that landed on the leaf is. And if that insect is unlucky enough to come to the edge of the leaf, a long pair of legs comes out with web and throws it onto the insect and pulls it underneath, and then the spider eats. I spent a lot of hours watching happy face spiders do that.
You're a good teacher, Sam. Are there, can you talk about the current status of Ohia Lehua?
Yeah, so, rapid Ohia death is a major problem still. They're researching it. They know it's the fungus. They know that there are two main strains of that fungus, one of which is really, really bad, and one of which is less so, but less virulent, but still a major problem. Some of the breakthroughs that afforded me hope are that even in the hardest hit areas where nearly all the trees are dead, there's about 5% of the trees that are doing just fine. And I attribute that to the fact that Ohia Lehua is one of the most genetically diverse trees in our forest. And so just like when a disease runs through a population, those folks that have the genetic resistance to the disease will be the ones that are left and contribute to the generations to come. They've shown that seedlings of those morphs will germinate and not be hit by the fungus and are regrowing in some of those areas. And so
Even though it was really, really bad, the whole idea of all the ohia will be gone and it's doomed, the end of Hawaiian wet forest, that is less likely now. It's still a bad thing because nowadays with all of the non-native plants that are there, whenever you remove the canopy,
Then they
go
over.
crazy. Yeah, and they can take over. And so it adds another layer of management challenge to those people that are working to preserve the native biocultural diversity that we've got.
We have a question here about the relationship of the lunar phases with planting and fishing.
That's really interesting to me. I think if you think about it, on all of the ole days, you're not supposed to go fishing, right?
Like
and
now,
there are quite
right?
a few of them. There are quite a few of them on both the waxing portion as well as the waning portion of a lunation, which means that for about a quarter of a month, every month, the ocean resources are given a break. And so those kinds of cyclic restrictions on behavior, when you compare it to the free-for-all that we've got these days, means that no matter what your population was, the ocean would get a rest every month during that period of time. And so it struck me that many of those planting conventions and fishing conventions were due to things like, when the tides are high, you're going to have rush for oceans, and maybe it's not the best time to go out in the canoe. But it also led to this really interesting regulation of access to resources.
Interesting. Smart. Okay. Do you think that the return to traditional ecological knowledge and values in public education and land management that has begun is changing the next generation's relationship to the land and helping to create a more sustainable future?
I hope so. I mean, the thing is when you teach about it, that's one thing, but you really have to get people onto the land. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to take them way up into a pristine native forest. You can go visit Manoa Heritage Center.
I know, I was just gonna say.
And get some training on their significance. We have Kavika Winter, Michael Demota, and I have a publication in prep for Pacific Conservation Biology.
Wow.
And it's a special issue on biocultural approaches.
Very
and
cool.
So, our paper talks about how to explore biocultural significance in Hawaiian language sources.
Wow.
Like I was saying, first step is to be able to speak Hawaiian. The second step is to be able to organize what you get out of the words in a way that might make sense and in a way that might be trained anybody might be able to do. And so look for that. We got our review edit comments back, and they said with some changes, it will be ready for publication. So I think it'll come out maybe the end of the calendar year. But we continue to work to offer tools on how to approach this. But the main tool is to get people onto the land and sea and get intimately familiar with what is there, so that any time of year they would be able to tell you what is going on there. I mean, I barely do that, and I've been at it for like 40 years. So it's because the younger you are, the more you can be trained to internalize that kind of intimate knowledge along the course of the year.
Is there a way to combine that style of management and resources with tourism?
Some of the most sophisticated tourists are the ones that love this kind of information.
Right.
And so if you're not there to just lie on the sand and drink Mai Tai out of an umbrella drink, then you might be interested in learning these kinds of things. I certainly, whenever I go traveling to a different part of the world, I try to find somebody who knows something about the natural history of the place, the names of the birds, the names of the plants growing in a forest. I want to go out and go see a natural area if they've got one. So
I know I'm not alone, or at least I hope I'm not alone. I know a
Yeah.
lot of people love to do that kind of thing, learn about where they're going, um, and and so I think there's room for that in Hawaii ecotourism.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been asked by the hotels to write articles that if you get into your room and there's this
Right.
little book on the
Right.
table that tells you where to eat and stuff, but it'll also have little vignettes of life in Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
And I've written ones on the natural history of various places. For example, if you're at Kihei, then it'll be for Maui
Mm-hmm.
as they explore Maui. So
That would be a
I think there's
gift.
room for it.
What is your vision for Kaho'olawe?
Well, Kaho'olawe is a tough one because it's a dry place. And it's just like California, right? I thought when I think of the thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres burning up, or in Australia, right? When those fires hit, it's just a fire can take out decades of effort,
Right.
right? So it's really tough. You look at Kaho'olawe, and I realize that natural fires, maybe they don't happen as frequently in Hawaii as they do on the continental on the continent. But there must have been some natural fires, and they were probably dampened by various factors. One of which is we have very few grasses. Our native grasses are mostly bunch grasses,
Mm-hmm.
and many of them don't live in dry areas. Before fountain grass came into Kona, it was rough with dry forest, nearly down to sea level. But as soon as fountain grass came in and allowed fire to sweep through the understory of dry forest, then we started seeing huge losses of those species. So Kaho'olawe back in the day must have had a really interesting dry forest system on it. Probably lacked too many grasses. Pili would have been one of the things that you might expect to find, but pili is one of those seasonal things too. During the driest times of year, it might not be as abundant, and when the wet season came, they would be there. So, it's hard. Kaho'olawe is going to be hard. I have hope for it because you can't be a conservation biologist without being an optimist.
This is true.
We would have to set up systems so that fires cannot spread across the entire island, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you created modules on Kaho'olawe that are separated by very strong fire break systems, you could probably set up something where the island would be able to come back into its own.
Here, another question. Entrenched warfare seems at odds with Hawaiians' close connection to land. How do we reconcile that, or what do you think about that?
Oh, so you're talking about warfare in ancient Hawaii?
I think so.
Yeah, and so when you think about it, remember that warfare was forbidden during the time of Lono, right?
Right.
And so
that's
even
regulated
something
too.
as simple as you might be really angry at your cousin who is on the island next door, but you are not going to attack him until the season of Ku comes, and even then, warfare in Hawaii was a highly ritualized thing. In many cases, that kind of broke down when Kamehameha got guns and learned different kinds of tactics from Isaac Davis and John Young. And so when we think about warfare, say in the time of Kamehameha, that would have been different from the very ritualized warfare of times before that. So I would say it doesn't, to me, it's not at odds, because as I said, the four akua would govern everything in the universe, including human behavior. And there would be a time for everything, and a time when you absolutely cannot do these things, despite how you might feel.
I think this might be our last question, but, or we have a couple more. Do you see any evidence of the connection for a more sustainable future through the networks of mutual support appearing during this pandemic? So has anything come up in the last, I guess, 6 months now that gives you even more hope?
Well, you know, did you see in the news the other day, it was just maybe a few days ago, that a group of kumuhula
Yes, yes,
imposed kapu on
yes.
their students and
So
encouraged
cool.
all hula practitioners to follow that kapu. This is kind of a neat thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
You might also notice that maybe a day or two before that broke the news, I posted that on Facebook.
Yes.
Because this kind of discussion was occurring quietly. And Mehana Hind was the one that decided to create a public face to it.
Right.
And
that was awesome.
That was awesome. And so the idea of taking the rigor of kapu in a halau hula, and hula being the most intact of the practices of ancient times that has come with us, and applying that toward a positive end that's entirely modern in its context is a very cool thing to me.
I know, that is cool. I was hopeful when I saw that. Can you talk about the problem of tourists posting photos on social media of places that people should not be going to?
There's so much of that. Oh my gosh.
I know.
I mean, when I saw the trampoline set up at the top of the stairway to heaven, I was like, come on.
Yeah.
So, and it's not only tourists though, it's anybody who really doesn't have that connection anymore.
You're right.
between the lands and the seas.
That's true.
And really aren't thinking about it, you know, in terms of anything but, you know, making a splash on social media. So yeah, that's a thing, and it's a shame.
Well, I think that is all we have, Sam. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughtfulness. My pleasure,
and thank you everybody for coming and listening. I hope that that was informative and leaves you a little bit more hopeful.
Absolutely. Mahalo nui, everybody. Have a great rest of your evening, and maybe go walk outside and visit your favorite place.
That's right.
Mahalo, Sam.
Okay, I'll stay on when everybody goes away, and then we can.
Okay, sounds good.
Chat a little afterwards.
Okay.
So aloha, everybody.
Aloha.